You're listening to PodCatalyst, the official podcast of IABC, where communicators from around the world tell their stories. Let's get started with today's episode.
Hi, my name is Julian Treasure, and I'm an author, speaker, and expert on sound and the critical communication skills of speaking and listening. And I think conscious communication always creates understanding.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning into PodCatalyst. Our guest today is Julian Treasure, an expert in sound and listening. I really enjoyed this conversation with Julian, and I think it comes at a perfect time. In talking with a few members within IABC, I've noticed this trend around the concept of listening. It's becoming a lost skill and something that isn't taught enough or is simply hard to teach in the first place. So if you're in a place in your line of work or your career where you find you're needing to take a step back, slow down, and really listen to the world around you, I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode. Julian will be a spotlight speaker at the IABC World Conference this June, so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can visit wc.iabc.com, and we'll make sure to put the link in the show notes for you too. All right, let's get started and listen to what Julian has to say. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Frankevich, your host for today's episode of PodCatalyst. Julian, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're looking forward to your session at World Conference. But before we kind of get into that, I want to hear from you. What led you to focus your career on sound and listening?
I think being a musician had a lot to do with it. Musicians have to listen to the world in a slightly different way, perhaps, than non-musicians. If you're playing in a band or in an orchestra, you have to listen to all the other instruments at the same time, very attentively. So it's an attentive multi-track listening, which is it's a skill that gets developed. And you're playing at the same time, of course, so you have to be able to listen consciously whilst doing something at the same time. And I think I took that into my experience of the world. I think many musicians probably do. So I worked in marketing for many years, first of all in media, then in magazine publishing. I launched my own magazine publishing company, producing customer magazines, which many IABC members will be very familiar with. I think in America they call them custom publications. In the UK it's contract publishing. And I grew that company and was working with clients like Microsoft, Orange, Lexus, and so forth, producing beautiful magazines for their customers. And I sold that in 2002. All the way through that career in marketing, I'd been listening to the world and thinking, it doesn't sound very good, So I was then able to bring the two sides of me together because I've been playing music, listening to the world, thinking it's so noisy. And really considering the fact I was working with brands, I was very aware that perhaps they weren't listening very well to the noise that they were making. So there's this kind of unconscious noise. Most of the noise around us, after all, is made by organizations. It's made by companies, brands, other organizations. So I started a company in 2003 called The Sound Agency, which asked that question, how does your brand sound? And worked producing, sonic logos. So, you can immediately think of examples. I bet not many people listening to this could draw Intel's logo, but I'm sure many people can hear it in their head. That da-da-da-da.
Oh, sure.
So that kind of powerful little sound can encapsulate a great deal about a company, just as a visual logo can. And then we ended up specializing in soundscapes in physical spaces, lots of retail spaces, shopping malls and places like that, replacing noise and mindless music with design sound, often based on nature. And that eventually caused a spin-off company to be launched called Mood Sonic, which now does that for offices with biophilic generative soundscapes, which are beautiful and reduce distraction. So they're good for people as well as good for productivity. So that was my journey. And in the process, I got the opportunity to give a TED talk about the effects of sound, and then another one about sound and health. And then I had my epiphany. It suddenly occurred to me that the reason organizations don't listen very well is because the people in them don't listen very well. And so my third TED Talk was about listening as a skill. And then I think the fourth one was about designing spaces. It was a plea to architects, really, to start designing with their ears as well as their eyes. And the last talk was about the skill of speaking. And that's the one that went absolutely ballistic. I think it's the sixth most watched TED Talk of all time, which is, it's been seen by millions and millions and millions of people. It's very daunting for me to think like there's a football stadium full of people in my talk every day. It's really amazing. I mean, mind-boggling. So that put me onto a different track, really, not organizational sound. I've transferred really to my passion in life, which is personal communication skills, the skills of speaking and listening. And never have, especially the second one of those, never has that been needed more than it is in the world today, I think.
That's a beautiful way to think about the world around us, right? And how sound and communication really play a role. And fascinating that you found a way to weave your passion into the work you've done. That's really, really interesting.
Well, it is a wonderful thing to be working on something you're completely passionate about. It gives me a zeal and a reason to get up every morning, even though, I'm 65 now, so I'm no spring chicken, but I intend to be doing this for a good few years yet, because at the moment, all I can see is these skills degrading in the world. And it concerns me greatly. There's an addiction in the world to being right, making people wrong, judging people, condemning people. And we see it in politics with the polarization that we see in, just about every country I can think of at the moment. And we see it being driven by the internet, where you get internet shaming, you get pile-ons, you get trolling, you get all this kind of hate and people making themselves feel better by disparaging others. That process of making people wrong is so prevalent now, and it's so destructive to society, to social living, to friendships, and to politics, to democracy. I gave a talk quite a few years ago, a TEDx talk in Athens, the cradle of democracy, called The Sound of Democracy. And I was basically saying, listen, the sound of democracy is listening to other people, understanding other people. Because without that understanding, how can we live next door to people with whom we fundamentally disagree? We're on a slippery slope if we start to disparage everybody we disagree with. And that slippery slope of caricaturing people and demonizing people, that ends up with disagree with me and I'll kill you. And we've seen that play out in all sorts of places. You just have to think what happened in that terrible event in Rwanda a few years ago. Or, it's kind of the ISIS solution to the world, isn't it? Disagree with me and I kill you. So that is not a world I want my children growing up in. And I am seeing us sliding in that direction. This is not trivial. This is something we all need to be deeply concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's a matter of going back to basics too, right? That foundational idea of listening, which I think leads me into my next question for you. You're going to be one of our spotlight speakers at World Conference in June, and you're focusing on listening as a forgotten skill. So not really something taught in schools or even at times part of our workforce training. Why do you think that is? And where is the opportunity to change the conversation?
The why is very complex. We have become enormously ocular, I think, particularly in the Western world. Writing was only invented 5,000 years ago, We've been using complex language for at least 100,000 years, if not more. Yeah. And before that, non-verbal acoustic communication, grunts, singing, just intonation perhaps to communicate. So, hearing has been an incredibly important window to the world to us, as well as our primary warning sense, of course. And perhaps we've lost contact with that. I mean, I see people now cycling with headphones on, and I think we've definitely lost contact with hearing as our primary warning sense, because that's just crazy. So I think over the period since writing was invented, and I'm not disparaging writing, it's done incredible things. It's changed the world, and it's publishable, and, it's CCable, as we all know now, with our email inboxes groaning with rubbish. It's taken over to the point where we have almost forgotten the skills of speaking and listening. And in fact, to the point where many people don't even realize these things are skills. We don't teach them in school. I mean, in America, you do rather more speaking than perhaps we do in the UK, at least public speaking skills. I think they're taken relatively seriously.
Yeah.
But listening, who teaches listening? And when you think about this, how crazy is it that we don't teach our children first how to listen, because they would then receive so much more of their education? We spend all our time with education focusing on the sending of it. How good are the teachers? How good is the curriculum or the syllabus? We never think about the receiving of it. Can the children hear? Which often, sadly, is not the case in acoustically poor classrooms. And if they can hear, and there's group work going on, it can be very noisy. If they can hear, then are they listening? Do they know how to listen effectively, how to pay attention, how to process, how to understand? I mean, listening is work. It's not nothing. It's not a capability. Hearing is a capability. Listening's different. And just in the same way, the realization that it's a skill that you can master, you can practice, you can become better at, and that perhaps at the moment you're not masterful of, the same applies to speaking. The human voice, the instrument we all play, and, I think I will be able to get in Chicago talking about both sides of the coin here, because I think they're both important. And of course, the second one is more interesting to people than the first one. My TED Talk about speaking has been seen by at least 5 times as many people as my TED Talk about listening. Now, I wish that were the other way around, but it isn't. So my doorway to get people to listen to me very often is to talk about speaking, because that's what everybody wants to be heard.
Yeah.
Not many people are interested in listening, and that's unfortunate. But it's it's ego driven. We are ego driven creatures. Ultimately, we and everybody wants to be noticed and paid attention to and validated in that way. But they are both skills, and in my world, listening is the foundational skill. If you want to be a great speaker, then you need also to be a good listener, at least a good listener, if not a great listener. If you want to be a great leader of a team or an organization, you need to be a good listener. It's a fundamental, foundational skill that we just ignore, tragically.
Yeah. Well, and what you said about hearing is a capability and listening is a skill is a really interesting frame of reference for those who maybe don't think of it that way, right? The skill is something you have to practice and maybe struggle with at first and grow from. A capability, if you can hear, that's different.
Yes.
Really drives home that point of this is something we have to learn and practice at.
Very much so, which we don't teach in schools. And then, as you rightly said, in organizations, it's very rarely trained. And even less so is it assessed or remunerated. So think of how many 360-degree reviews actually have the question in, is he or she a good listener in all directions? And then do we reward the people who are great listeners for being great listeners? I don't think so. It's just ignored. It's assumed to be a universal capability, and that is so fundamentally not true. And we all know that. If you reflect inwards, anybody listening to this, think about the people around you. How many of them are great listeners? How do you prefer talking to the people who are great listeners? Do you prefer working for a boss who's a great listener and understands you? And yet we don't put the effort in as organizations or in our educational systems to foster this incredibly important skill.
So with that in mind, are there organizations or perhaps influencers, individuals in this place who are doing this well and can be a model to learn from? Are there, examples out there?
Well, I haven't come across very many, I have to say.
Hmm.
I've come across, I continually come across organizations who are being damaged or limiting their success by not prioritizing this. So, to be honest, I think we're at the beginning of this road, and I'm just hoping I'm maybe laying the first few bricks in the road, and more people will start to travel it. I know that Mike Pounceford has just written, former IABC president, I think president or chair, I can't remember the job title, but boss. Anyway, boss. He's just written an excellent book about organizational listening, which is fundamental. So, we're on parallel tracks here, and organizations do have to put into place cultural and structural and procedural measures to make sure that listening is fostered and encouraged and not disparaged. I've been in many organizations where asking a question is considered to be a sign of weakness. It's competitive like that. Those kind of organizations where, if you leave at knocking off time at 5:30, you're absolutely never going to get promoted. You have to show you're willing by staying the latest. And all that kind of competitive stuff is very damaging for listening. I've been in organizations where they're run by people who don't listen, or where bad news is not acceptable. And that's a terrible culture. Are there structures in place? Are there ways in which people can, even anonymously, reflect suggestions or complaints about the way things are happening? I'll give you another example which continually drives me nuts is complaints management in organizations, where complaints are tremendous opportunities to improve what you're doing. Customer complaints, I'm talking about. And yet we are now perpetrating, that the greatest lies in the world, the most common lies in the world, and we're experiencing higher than usual call volumes. One. And your call is important to us, that one, because there are metrics like time to clear in call centers, where the objective is to get the customer off the phone as quickly as possible so you can get on to the next one. That's quantity, not quality. And what is being missed very often, almost universally, is an opportunity to take that complaint and say, is there something in that complaint which would allow us to change a process and improve our organization and make customers happier? If there is, are the call center people, trained to spot that? And then do they have anything to do with it? Is there a person that they can send it to and say, here's a good one. How about doing that? Most of the cases that I've come across, it's a dead end. That person on the phone is there to try and pacify, mollify a customer, give them a few free this is or that's to make them go away. And what could have been a multi-million-dollar potentially improvement to process just evaporates. So listening and the culture of listening and the environment for listening, they're all wrapped up. And we have to do all of it together, really. But to me, it starts with teaching individual human beings how to listen.
So, Julian, you've noted that listening is good for business and individual well-being. And I think you'll touch on some of that in your presentation this June. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of these tangible benefits?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's become pretty clear with the research that's been done. There was a great piece of research done some years ago called the Organizational Listening Project, which I know, again, Mike Pounceford talks about in his book.
Yes.
Done by an Australian professor who's an excellent expert on this. What they found is that listening in organizations was pretty abject first. There were 5 times as much resource being put into outbound communication as was being put into listening. Outbound communication, when you say corporate communication, everybody thinks immediately about PR, advertising, marketing, social media. Outbound is sending. So again, we have this interesting meme where outbound trumps inbound, just as with my TED Talk on speaking being much more popular than the TED Talk on listening. So that was the situation. They then did a league table of organizations looking at those that were ranked as better listeners and those that were ranked as worse listeners by their own people. And what they found is that the better listening ranked organizations had better staff and customer loyalty. They had more productive people. They had happier everybody. I mean, all of their outcomes were improved. The ones at the bottom of the table had more crises and more conflict in their recent past. So it plays out into the bottom line. Fundamentally, if you're a listening organization, your people are happier, they're more productive, your customers are happier, and you're more profitable. This is all, absolutely a return on a very small investment it takes to get listening right. But it's non-trivial. I mean, I'm not saying it's a trivial investment. It has to start from the top. You can't just send an email around saying, tomorrow we're going to be a listening organization. That doesn't work. It's more profound than that. And it does require looking at the culture of the organization. And, alongside the culture might be a plaque on the wall when you walk into the office. How are people actually behaving? What are the behavioral memes and habits that go on? What are the stories people are telling each other about the organization and the way it behaves? Are there limits being placed there on freedom of expression, on listening, and so forth? And are there processes in place to promote and foster listening, which might be, it might be a secret input where people can go and post messages or complaints or suggestions or whatever they are on a sort of internal graffiti wall of some kind, anonymous perhaps. I mean, whatever it takes really to get people to express themselves honestly and openly. And within that, there are so many benefits. I remember for my book, How to Be Heard, I interviewed a range of interesting people. And one of them was Hiram Smith, who was the CEO of Stephen Covey's organization behind the book, The 7 Habits and so forth. And he told me the story of one time when they listened to a guy who was on their binder production line who had an idea, which then turned into a multi-million-dollar saving for them in the way that they were binding the books. And if they hadn't listened to him, if they dismissed him as just a grunt on the production line, they would have missed that opportunity. So he was passionate. He said he thinks listening is the most important skill any leader can ever have. I would put alongside that speaking, though, if you go into Warren Buffett's office, which I doubt you or I ever will, there's only one plaque on the wall of Warren Buffett's office. And I wonder if you can guess what it is. It's his certificate for completing Dale Carnegie's public speaking course.
Okay.
And Warren Buffett says that he believes that a skill in public speaking, in speaking in front of other people, raises an individual's lifetime earnings by 50% at least. So that's a powerful thing for us all to consider. This is an instrument. We all play it. And I don't think many of us would like to go on stage in the Carnegie Hall or the Albert Hall to give a piano recital without having lessons or any practice. That would be somewhat stressful. And that's, after all, why many people find the idea of public speaking very frightening. Now, it's not true that people fear public speaking more than they fear death. I mean, I looked that up some years ago. It's an urban fairy tale, that one. It came from a spurious piece of research. But I know a lot of people are seriously frightened about public speaking. And that's because we don't practice it. So, I was seriously frightened the first time I got on a bike. And you just remember the first time you drove after passing your driving test, your hands are gripping the wheel.
Right.
Body is tense and you're sweating and so forth. Well, now, of course, you drive from A to B and you don't even remember doing it because you were thinking about everything but driving. So practice, that's, a lot of the answer here, and coaching and training and so forth. But we don't do it. So it's not surprising that even when I'm talking to an audience of CEOs, I travel the world doing keynotes about these things, and an audience of very senior managers. How many of you use your voice in your work, in public speaking? A forest of hands goes up. Okay. How many of you have had formal vocal training? About 3, normally. I just think, what's going on? If your voice is that important to you, for goodness sake, practice, train, get coached, improve it. It's just, you wouldn't want to run a company if you had absolutely no idea about accounts and how to look at them. It's a similar skill, just as important, and yet we leave it alone.
Yeah. Well, Julian, I want to end on one more question that we like to ask all of our guests. What gets you up in the morning?
First of all, my daughter, who is 2, that's certainly effective. Recommend it to anybody who has a problem getting up in the morning. But after my family, then it's definitely this crisis that I see in the world of lack of listening and shouting and, inconsiderate speaking, ill-considered speaking, I should say. So, if I can get up in the morning and do something about that, whether it's by, I've just developed a workshop, which, I'm very excited. I just delivered that for the first time to the NHS, the National Health Service management team in the UK. And that's really exciting to me, to take that work into organizations and start helping people to practice first of all, to realize that these are skills, because that's the first thing. Most people don't even realize these are skills, and then give them tools, ways of practicing to improve these things. And I see every person that I can touch in this way, including the 150 million people who've seen the TED Talks, which is it's the reason I love that number, is because they're ripples in a pond. Everybody who starts listening better, they have an effect on the people around them. If somebody's not listening to you, you're not going to get very far by telling them off for not listening. But if you listen to them and you show them how to do it, then it spreads. It is contagious in the best possible way. So that's what gets me up in the morning, is my passion. Because if we have, and I'll probably end on this in Chicago. So if you're going to be there, sorry, you're hearing the ending already. But if we have a world where people are speaking consciously to people who are listening consciously, there is only one outcome, and that is understanding. And that is a prize worth fighting for.
Well, Julian, I think that's a perfect note to end on. It has been fascinating speaking with you, listening to you. I've really enjoyed our time together, and I'm looking forward to seeing your presentation this June in Chicago at World Conference.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for the time, Kristen. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to PodCatalyst, the official podcast of IABC. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Have a suggestion for a future episode? Send us a note at catalyst@iabc.com. To discover all IABC has to offer, visit our website at iabc.com. Until next time.